The police didn't find my wife. They found the man she was grieving. That was the sentence that ended my marriage, though I didn't understand it yet. 3 days earlier, Lily had disappeared without a trace. No note, no warning, no argument leading up to it. Just gone. Her phone went straight to voicemail, her car was still in the driveway, and her coffee mug sat half full on the kitchen counter like she had only stepped out for a minute. I remember standing there at 7:12 in the morning, staring at that mug, thinking how strange it was that something so small could feel so wrong. Lily wasn't the kind of person who vanished. She texted if she was going to be 10 minutes late. She called if traffic got bad. She had routines, rhythms, a way of moving through life that felt predictable, safe. Or at least that's what I believed. The first day, I told myself it was a misunderstanding. Maybe her phone died. Maybe she went to stay with a friend. I called everyone she knew, her sister in Denver, her coworker Melissa, even an old college roommate I hadn't heard her mention in years. No one had seen her. By the second day, the silence started to feel heavier, like the walls of the house were closing in inch by inch. I barely slept, just sat on the edge of the bed staring at the door, half expecting her to walk in with an apology, and a simple explanation that would make everything make sense again. But she didn't. By the third day, I was standing in a police station, hands clenched so tight they ached, explaining to a stranger that my wife was missing. The officer nodded, calm, methodical, asking questions I struggled to answer. Any recent arguments? No. Any reason she might leave voluntarily? No. Any unusual behavior lately? I hesitated there. Because if I was honest, there had been something. Small things. Easy to ignore at the time. The way she started taking her phone into the other room. The late nights that didn't quite line up with her work schedule. The distance in her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking. At the time, I told myself it was stress. People go through phases. Marriage isn't always perfect. That's what you tell yourself when you don't want to see the crack forming. The officer wrote everything down, his pen scratching across the paper like it already knew more than I did. We'll look into it, he said. Try to stay available. Stay available. As if my entire life wasn't already frozen in place waiting for her to come back. That night, I sat alone in the living room, the TV on mute, the glow of the screen flickering across empty furniture. Every sound outside made my head snap up. Every passing car, every distant siren, every footstep on the sidewalk felt like it could be the moment everything returned to normal. But normal didn't come back. Instead, the next morning my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered immediately, heart pounding like it already knew this call would change everything. Mr. Carter? The voice said, calm, official. This is Detective Harris. We've located your wife. For a second, I couldn't breathe. Relief hit first, fast and overwhelming. Is she okay? I asked. There was a pause. Just a fraction of a second. But it stretched long enough to feel wrong. Physically, yes, he said carefully. But there's something you need to understand before you see her. My grip tightened on the phone. What do you mean? Another pause. Then this sentence that split my life clean in half. Your wife wasn't missing, he said. She was attending a private service, mourning someone. I frowned, confusion cutting through the relief. Mourning who? And that's when everything I thought I knew about my life started to fall apart. The line went quiet after I asked the question, like the world itself was deciding how much truth I could handle at once, and when Detective Harris finally spoke again, his voice carried that careful tone people use when they already know the damage is done but still feel obligated to soften the blow. His name is Ryan Blake, he said, and the name meant nothing to me at first, just another stranger in a world full of strangers, until something in the way he said it made my chest tighten, like my body understood before my mind could catch up. Do you know him? He asked, and I opened my mouth to say no, but the word got stuck somewhere between my lungs and my throat because suddenly I was remembering small things, disconnected moments that never made sense on their own, a name half heard during a phone call she quickly ended, A contact saved without a last name, a story about a colleague she never introduced me to. I am not sure, I said instead, and even to my own ears it sounded weak, uncertain, like I was already losing ground. Harris did not respond right away, and in that silence I could hear papers shifting on his end, the quiet mechanics of a truth being assembled piece by piece. Your wife has been at a private memorial service for the past 2 days, he continued. She listed herself as next of kin for notification purposes. And that was the moment the floor beneath me started to tilt, slow at first, almost unnoticeable, then sharper, like standing on something that was never stable to begin with. That does not make sense, I said, because it did not, because there was no version of my life where Lily would be someone else's emergency contact, no version where she would disappear without a word to me just to mourn another man. We found her at a funeral home about 40 miles outside the city, Harris added. She appeared distraught. He paused there, choosing the word carefully. More than what you would typically expect from a casual acquaintance. Casual acquaintance, the phrase echoed in my head like it was trying to convince me of something I already knew was not true, because grief does not look the same when it is real, and even without seeing her I could picture it. The way she used to cry during sad movies, the way her voice would soften when something mattered, and suddenly I realized I had never seen that level of emotion directed at me in a long time. I need you to come down here, he said, pulling me back. There are some things we need to clarify in person. I nodded even though he could not see me, my hand gripping the phone so tight my knuckles burned. Yes, I will be there, I managed, and when the call ended the house felt different, not empty the way it had the past 3 days, but wrong. Like every object around me had quietly shifted into a place it did not belong. I looked at the couch where we used to sit together, the kitchen where she left that half-finished coffee, the hallway lined with photos that suddenly felt staged, like a version of reality carefully curated for appearances. And for the first time since she disappeared I was not imagining her walking back through the door with an explanation. I was imagining something else entirely, something colder, something that had been there all along without me noticing. Because the truth was starting to take shape whether I wanted it to or not, and it was asking a question I was not ready to answer. What if she had never really been mine to begin with? I do not remember the drive to the station, not the traffic lights or the turns or the way my hands stayed locked on the wheel like they were holding something together that was already breaking apart. I just remember pulling into the parking lot and sitting there for a second longer than necessary, staring at my own reflection in the windshield like I was trying to recognize the man looking back at me, because somewhere between that phone call and this moment something had shifted, something quiet but irreversible, and when I finally stepped inside the building the air felt colder than it should have, too clean, too controlled, like a place where emotions were meant to be processed instead of felt. Detective Harris met me near the front desk, exactly how I imagined him, mid-40s, composed. The kind of man who had delivered news like this more times than he could count. Mr. Carter, he said, offering a firm handshake that I barely registered. Thank you for coming in. I nodded, my voice staying somewhere behind my ribs. I need to see her, I said, direct, because there was no other reason for me to be there. He studied me for a moment, like he was measuring how much I could handle, then gestured down the hallway. She is in an interview room. But before that there are a few things you should understand. I did not want understanding, I wanted answers, but I followed him anyway, because at that point I had already crossed into a reality where nothing worked the way it used to. The man she was mourning, Harris continued as we walked, Ryan Blake, 36, local business consultant, no criminal record, passed away due to a medical complication 2 days ago. The words were clinical, detached, but each one landed heavier than the last, not because of what they said, but because of what they implied. And my wife was, what, a friend? I asked, even though the question sounded hollow the moment it left my mouth. Harris did not answer immediately, and that silence told me more than any explanation could. She was listed as his primary contact, he said finally, and she has been present for all arrangements since his passing. Primary contact. The phrase echoed the same way next of kin had, official, undeniable, like a role she had been playing in a life I knew nothing about. We stopped outside a closed door, a simple room with a narrow window, and through the glass I saw her, Lily, sitting at the table with her hands folded in front of her, staring down like the weight of something invisible was pressing her into that chair. She looked the same and completely different at the same time, her hair slightly out of place, her posture smaller, but it was her expression that stopped me, because I had seen her sad before, I had seen her tired, even frustrated. But this was something else, something deeper, something that did not belong to the life we shared. "She has not asked for you," Harris said quietly beside me, and that sentence cut sharper than anything else so far, not because it was loud, but because it was simple, clean, undeniable. I kept my eyes on her, waiting for some instinct, some connection to pull her gaze toward me, but she did not look up, not even once, and in that moment I realized something I had not been ready to admit. Whatever she was feeling in that room, whatever she had been doing for the past 3 days, it was real to her in a way that had nothing to do with me, and for the first time since this started, I was not just confused, I was starting to understand that I had been standing outside the truth of my own life for a very long time without even knowing it. I kept my eyes on her through that narrow strip of glass, waiting for something to shift, some instinct that would make her look up and see me standing there, but she stayed exactly the same, still, distant. Like whatever world she was in did not include me anymore, and after a few seconds that felt longer than the past 3 days combined, I reached for the door handle, my hand hesitating just for a fraction of a second before I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that makes every movement feel louder than it should be, and when the door clicked shut behind me, she finally reacted, her shoulders tensing slightly before she lifted her head and looked at me. And for a brief moment I saw something flash across her face, surprise, maybe guilt, maybe something else entirely, but it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that same distant calm that made her feel like a stranger sitting in my wife's place. "Lily," I said, her name sounding unfamiliar in my own voice, like I was testing whether it still belonged to her. She blinked once. Slow, deliberate, then looked down at her hands again. "You should not be here," she said quietly, and that sentence hit harder than I expected, not because of the words themselves, but because of how easily she said them, like my presence was an inconvenience, like I had stepped into a space I was not supposed to enter. "I have been looking for you for 3 days," I replied, my voice steady but tight. 3 days, Lily," she exhaled, a slow breath that did not quite reach her eyes. "I needed time," she said, and I felt something in my chest tighten further, because that was not an explanation, that was an excuse, the kind you give when the truth is too complicated or too uncomfortable to say out loud. "Time for what?" I asked, and this time my voice did not stay as controlled as I wanted it to, because there was only so much calm a person could hold when everything around them was starting to unravel. She hesitated then, her fingers pressing together slightly as if she was deciding how much to say. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight I had not heard in a long time. "Someone died, Ethan," she said, and I nodded slowly. "I know that, the police told me," I replied. "Brian Blake," I added, watching her reaction carefully, and there it was again, that shift, subtle but undeniable, the way her eyes softened at the name, the way her posture changed just slightly. Like the room itself had tilted towards something more important than anything I had said so far. "He was not just someone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, and that was the moment the last piece of denial inside me started to crack, because there it was, not hidden behind excuses or deflection, not softened by vague language, just the truth sitting between us in the simplest form possible. "Then what was he?" I asked. Even though I was not sure I wanted the answer anymore, she looked up at me fully this time, and there was no confusion in her expression, no hesitation, just a quiet certainty that made everything feel heavier. "He mattered," she said, and for a second the room felt smaller, the air thinner, like there was not enough space left for both of us to stand in the same reality. "More than me?" I asked before I could stop myself, And that question hung there, sharp and exposed, the kind of question that does not need to be answered to already hurt. She did not respond right away, and in that silence I realized something I had missed all along. This was not new for her. This was not a sudden mistake or a moment of weakness. This was something she had been living with, carrying, protecting, and whatever it was, it had been important enough for her to disappear without a word and grieve. In a way she never had with me. And when she finally spoke, her voice did not break, it did not hesitate, it just landed, quiet and final. "It is not about more or less," she said. "It is about something you never understood." And in that moment I realized I had not just lost her 3 days ago, I had been losing her for a long time without ever knowing when it started. Her words did not come at me like an explosion, they settled in slowly, like dust after something had already collapsed, and for a moment I just stood there looking at her, trying to find the version of Lily I thought I knew somewhere behind that calm, distant expression, but the more I searched the more I realized that maybe that version had never been as real as I believed. "Then help me understand," I said finally, my voice quieter now, not because the pain had lessened but because it had shifted into something heavier, something harder to push against. She looked down again, her fingers tracing the edge of the table like she was grounding herself in something physical before stepping into whatever came next, and when she spoke her tone changed. Softer, not defensive, not apologetic, just certain. "I met him before you," she said, and that sentence alone was enough to tilt everything further, because it introduced a timeline I had never been part of, a history that existed outside the life we built together. "We were together for years," she continued, "before things ended." I swallowed, my throat dry. "Ended how?" I asked, even though I could already feel where this was going. She hesitated just briefly, then answered. "Life happened. We wanted different things, different paths. It was not dramatic, it just stopped," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that felt incomplete, like she was leaving out the part that mattered most. "And then you met me," I said, filling in the gap she did not. She nodded slightly. "Yes," she replied, and for a second there was silence again. But it was not empty, it was full of everything unsaid, everything I was starting to piece together on my own. "So what, he just came back?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to keep this grounded in logic even as it slipped further away. She shook her head slowly. "He never really left," she said, and that was the moment something inside me finally cracked, not loudly, not in a way anyone else could see, but in a quiet, irreversible way that changed how everything fit together, because that sentence did not just explain the last 3 days, it explained the last several years, every late night, every distant look, every small shift I ignored because it was easier to believe in the version of our life that felt stable. "You were still seeing him," I said, not as a question but as a realization, and she did not deny it, she did not argue, she just sat there, her silence filling the room louder than any confession could. "How long?" I asked, and this time my voice did not stay steady, it thinned out at the edges, like something stretched too far. She closed her eyes for a second, then opened them again, meeting mine fully. "On and off," she said. "For years." Years, the word echoed in my head like it did not belong to the same timeline I had been living in. Years meant this was not a mistake, not a moment, not something that could be explained away or fixed. It meant this was a second life running parallel to mine the entire time. "And I was what?" I asked, the question forming before I could stop it. "The safe choice, the stable one." She shook her head again, but this time there was something else in her expression, not guilt, not quite, but something close to recognition. "You were my life," she said, and for a brief second I almost believed it, until she added, "But he was something different." And there it was again, that separation, that division she had created between two realities, one where I existed and one where I did not, and as I stood there listening to her, I realized that whatever I thought we had built together had never been whole, it had always been shared, divided, incomplete. And the worst part was not that she had chosen him in those 3 days. It was that she had been choosing him in ways I never saw for a very long time, long before I even knew there was a choice being made. The word years did not just sit in the air, it settled into everything, into the walls, into the space between us, into every memory I had ever trusted, and for a moment I did not say anything because there was nothing left to say that would make this smaller, nothing that could reshape what I had just heard into something I could live with. I just stood there, looking at her, really looking this time, not as my wife. Not as the person I thought I knew, but as someone who had been living a reality parallel to mine for longer than I could trace, and slowly, almost without realizing it, pieces started lining up. Moments that once felt harmless now carried weight. Nights she said she was too tired to talk, weekends she needed space, the way she sometimes smiled at her phone and then quickly put it away when I walked into the room. At the time I told myself it was normal, people have private thoughts, private moments. But now those fragments rearranged themselves into something sharper, something undeniable. You said he never left, I said quietly, my voice steadier than I expected, because somewhere along the way the shock had started to turn into clarity. And clarity, even when it hurts, has a way of grounding you. She nodded once, slow, like she had already accepted what this meant long before I walked into that room. We tried to stay away, she said. After I met you, I really did. And for a second I almost believed that too, because it sounded like something a person would say to make sense of something complicated. But then she added, but every time we thought it was over, it was not. And there it was again, that pattern, not a single mistake, not a moment of weakness, but a cycle, something that kept pulling her back no matter what life she built on the surface. So what was I supposed to be? I asked. Not because I expected a fair answer, but because I needed to hear how she saw it. She looked at me, and for the first time there was something close to conflict in her expression, like even she knew there was no clean way to explain it. You were real, she said. Everything we had was real. And I let out a quiet breath at that, not because it comforted me, but because it revealed something even more unsettling, that she did not see this as a lie, not entirely. She saw it as two truths existing at the same time. You cannot have two real lives, Lily, I said, my voice low but firm now. One of them is a lie. She shook her head slightly, not in denial, but like she was rejecting the simplicity of that statement. It does not feel that simple when you are inside it, she replied, and maybe she was right. Maybe from her perspective it never felt like a choice between right and wrong. Maybe it felt like holding on to something she could not let go of while still trying to build something stable with me. But standing where I was now, outside of that perspective, it looked different. It looked like years of decisions made without me, years of a life I was never allowed to see. And now he is gone, I said, bringing it back to the present, to the reason we were in that room, to the reason everything had finally surfaced. Her expression shifted again, softer, heavier, and for the first time since I walked in I saw the full weight of her grief, not hidden, not controlled, just there, raw in a way that made everything else feel secondary. Yes, she whispered, and that single word carried more emotion than anything else she had said, because it was not about me, not about our marriage, not about the consequences waiting outside that room. It was about him, about losing something she had never really let go of, and in that moment I understood something I had not been ready to face before. I was not just dealing with betrayal, I was standing in the aftermath of a love that had nothing to do with me, a love that had existed before me, alongside me, and now, in some way, even after me, and the realization did not come with anger the way I expected. It came with something colder, something quieter, the understanding that no matter what I said or did next, I had never been the center of her story the way she had been the center of mine. The room felt different after that, like something invisible had settled between us and decided there was no going back to what we were before, and I realized I was not standing there trying to fix anything anymore. I was standing there trying to understand what came next, not for us, but for me, and that shift changed the way everything sounded, the way everything landed. So that is why you left, I said, not accusing, not even asking, just connecting the last piece. She nodded slowly, her eyes dropping again as if the weight of it had finally caught up to her. When I found out he was gone, I could not stay, she said, her voice softer now, but still steady, still certain in a way that made it clear. This decision had never been about me. I needed to be there, she added, and I let that sit for a second, because there was nothing unclear about it, no confusion left to hide behind. She had made a choice, not suddenly, not impulsively, but instinctively, like something inside her had already decided long before this moment. And not once did you think to tell me, I said, and this time there was a slight edge in my voice, not loud, not uncontrolled, just present, like a line being drawn. Quietly but firmly, she looked up at me again, and for the first time there was something close to regret in her expression, but it was not regret for what she had done, it was regret for what it meant now that it was exposed. I knew you would not understand, she said, and I almost let out a laugh at that, not because it was funny, but because it was familiar, that same quiet justification people use when they decide for you what you are capable of handling. You are right, I said, nodding. Once. I do not understand. And that honesty felt clearer than anything else I had said so far, because it was the truth. I did not understand how someone could build a life with one person while holding on to another for years. I did not understand how she could disappear without a word and expect that to be something I would eventually accept, and more than anything, I did not understand how I had missed it for so long. But here is what I do understand, I continued, my voice steady now, grounded in something that felt like control returning in small pieces. You did not just leave for 3 days, Lily. I paused, letting the words settle. You left a long time ago. She did not argue with that, she did not try to correct it or soften it, she just sat there, and her silence was louder than any defense she could have offered, because it confirmed what I was already starting to see clearly. This was not about one moment, one event, one decision. This was the result of something that had been unfolding quietly over years, and now that it was out in the open, there was no way to put it back where it had been. What happens now? She asked finally, her voice quieter, almost uncertain for the first time since I walked into that room, and that question hung there differently than everything else, because it was not about the past, it was about the future, about what we were supposed to do with everything that had just been said, and I realized I had been thinking about that already, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that felt like revenge or anger, but in a way that felt clear, like something inside me had already made the decision. While the rest of me was still catching up, I looked at her, really looked at her one more time, not searching for the person I used to know, but accepting the person sitting in front of me, and when I spoke, my voice did not shake, it did not rise, it just settled into the truth as simply as possible. No, I said. We stopped pretending this was ever whole. And as the words left my mouth, I felt something shift again, not breaking this time, but separating, like two paths finally pulling apart after running side by side for far too long, and for the first time since this started, I was not waiting for her to come back, I was already starting to walk away. For a second she just looked at me, like she was trying to measure whether I meant it, whether this was another moment that could be talked through, softened, reshaped into something survivable, but there was no space left for that anymore. Not after everything that had been said, not after everything that had been revealed without even needing to be explained, and I could see it in her expression when she finally understood that this was not an argument, this was not a phase, this was the end of something that had already been breaking long before either of us said it out loud. Ethan, she started, her voice quieter now, almost uncertain, like she was stepping into unfamiliar ground for the first time, but I shook my head slightly before she could finish, not harshly, not dismissively, just enough to stop whatever came next from turning into something we had already passed. No, I said, my tone calm, controlled in a way that felt different from before, not restrained, but resolved. Do not try to fix this. No. And the words did not come from anger, they came from clarity, the kind that only shows up after everything else has been stripped away. She closed her mouth slowly, her eyes dropping again, and for the first time since I walked into that room, she did not have anything ready to say, no explanation, no reasoning, no version of the story that could make it easier to accept, just silence, and that silence said more than anything else could, because it meant there was nothing left to defend, nothing left to justify, only consequences that had been waiting for this moment to arrive. I am not angry, I added after a second, and that surprised even me a little, not because it was not true, but because of how steady it felt, how real it was. I thought I would be. I continued. I thought I would walk in here and lose control, demand answers, ask why, but none of that changes what this is. I paused, letting that settle between us. You already made your choice, not just 3 days ago, not just when he died, but every time you went back. She looked up at that, her expression tightening slightly, but she did not argue, she did not interrupt, she just listened, because somewhere deep down she knew it was true. And I made mine too. I said, quieter now, but just as firm. I just did not know it yet. That part hung there for a second, because it was not something I had planned, it was something I had realized, piece by piece, while everything else was falling apart, and now that it was clear, there was no reason to pretend otherwise. I am done being part of something that was never whole. I finished, and as I said it, I felt that same shift again, but this time it was different. It was not something breaking, it was something settling into place, like the final piece of a puzzle that had been incomplete for too long. She inhaled slowly, her hands tightening slightly against the table, and for a moment it looked like she might say something, like she might try to reach for whatever was left between us, but then she stopped, and I could see it in her face. She understood, maybe not in the same way I did, maybe not with the same clarity, but enough to know that there was no version of this conversation that led back to what we had before. So that is it, she said finally, her voice low, almost distant again, and I nodded once, because there was nothing else to add, nothing else to explain. That is it, I confirmed, and the simplicity of those words carried more weight than anything else we had said so far, because they closed the space between what was and what would never be again. I stepped back. Slightly, not in a dramatic way, just enough to create distance where there had been none, and as I turned toward the door, I did not feel the urge to look back, not because it did not matter, but because I had already seen everything I needed to see, and as my hand reached for the handle, I realized something that felt almost strange in its clarity. This was not the moment I lost her. This was the moment I finally stopped losing myself trying to hold on to something that had never really been mine. I did not rush out of the building. I walked at the same pace I had walked in, steady, controlled, like nothing had just shifted beneath my feet, but everything had, and I could feel it in the way the air hit my face when I stepped outside, cooler, sharper, like the world had quietly reset while I was inside that room. I stood there for a second at the top of the steps, not looking back, not checking if she followed. Because I already knew she would not, and even if she did, it would not change what had already settled into place. I took a breath, slow, deliberate, the kind you take when you realize something has ended without needing a dramatic moment to mark it, and then I kept moving, across the parking lot, past the same cars I did not remember arriving next to, toward a life that suddenly felt unfamiliar in a way I could not fully explain yet. The drive home was quiet, not because there was no noise, but because none of it reached me. Traffic lights changed, cars passed. The city moved the way it always did, but I felt separate from it, like I was watching everything from a slight distance, and when I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, I just sat there for a moment, looking at the house, the same house that had felt stable, predictable, safe just a few days ago, and now it looked different, not broken, not ruined, just revealed, like a place that had been holding a truth I never noticed until now. I stepped inside and the silence greeted me again. But this time it did not feel heavy, it felt honest. Like the space was no longer pretending to be something it was not. I walked into the kitchen and saw the same coffee mug still sitting on the counter, the one she left behind that first morning, and I stared at it for a second before reaching out and emptying it into the sink, rinsing it clean, not because it mattered, but because it felt like something that needed to be done, a small, simple action in a moment where nothing else felt simple. I moved through the house slowly after that, not searching for anything, just seeing it differently, the photos on the wall, the couch where we used to sit, the bedroom down the hall. None of it held the same weight anymore, not because it was meaningless, but because I finally understood it for what it was, a life that had been real in parts but never complete, and that realization did not come with anger the way I once imagined it would. It came with a quiet acceptance that settled deeper the longer I stood there, Later that evening, my phone buzzed once. Her name on the screen, just a single message, no long explanation, no attempt to undo what had been said, just a few words that felt almost expected. I am sorry. I looked at it for a moment, not with resentment, not with the urge to respond, just with a kind of clarity that made everything simple in a way it had not been before, and then I set the phone down without replying, because some things do not need an answer once you understand them fully. I stepped outside onto the back porch as the sun started to dip lower, the sky shifting into that quiet orange that always made everything feel slower, and I leaned against the railing, letting the silence settle around me again, but this time it felt different, not empty. Not waiting, just open, like something had finally been cleared away, and as I stood there, I realized that the last 3 days had not been about losing her, not really, they had been about seeing the truth clearly enough to let go of something that was never whole, and in that understanding there was something unexpected, not relief exactly, but space, the kind that comes when you stop holding on to something that was already gone. And for the first time since all of this started, I was not thinking about where she was or what she was doing. I was thinking about what came next for me, not in a rushed way, not with answers already planned out, but with a quiet certainty that whatever came next would be built on something real, something that did not exist in two places at once, something that did not disappear without a word. And as the light faded and the air cooled around me, I understood one thing with a clarity that did not need to be questioned: she did not vanish for those 3 days, she just went back to a place where I had never truly existed, and now, for the first time, I was no longer trying to follow her there.